So good evening. How are you all tonight? Good, good. So my name is Dr. Kamal Rashid. I teach here at National Louis University. I'm in NCE in Educational Foundations and Inquiry. In our area, and this is a very great occasion to be here given the topic, because in the area that I teach in Educational Foundations and Inquiry, as well as curriculum advocacy and policy, we deal with many of these issues. One of the things that I was asked by Malcolm Oliver if I could come and introduce Prexy Nesbitt, and I was very pleased to do so, particularly because of the topic. We live in very interesting times, to say the least. One of the things that I was thinking about as I was reading Dr. Nesbitt's biography, and as I was thinking about these times and the topics, I thought about something that Du Bois wrote in his book, The Souls of Black Folks. He says very briefly in the chapter on Mr. Booker T. Washington and others, he makes this very passing reference to the spirit of an age. And he's really, paying a sort of backhanded compliment to Booker T. Washington in this part of the book. But he makes this point that Booker T. Washington was so astute that he was able to sense the spirit of his age and to align himself with it in such a way so as to present a message that both on a certain level represented the empowerment of black folks, but really represented a way of sustaining the interest of white racism in the South. And so it's a very interesting portrait. But this idea of the spirit of an age is one that lingered with me, because I think that that the times that we live in carry a certain spirit. They carry a certain essence, a certain character, a certain nature. And I think Dr. Nesbitt's life journey illustrates that, whether we're talking about his beginnings here in Chicago, particularly on the west side of Chicago, the various educational institutions that he navigated both in this country, but also in terms of his international work. We had a very brief exchange out in the lobby in Kiswahili because he spent some time at the University of Dar es Salaam. And East Africa and Southern Africa were very important places in terms of the struggle against colonialism. And this also takes me back to something that Du Bois wrote, I think in that same book, but also said it a few years earlier, that the problem of the 20th century would be the problem of the color line. And what was very interesting is that a few years ago, a scholar at the University of Colorado Boulder, Reland Rabaka, revisited that and said, hey, the color line may also be the problem of the 21st century. And so I think Dr. Nesbitt's experience in terms of looking at labor, in terms of looking at race, in terms of looking at these struggles of people for self-determination, both here and abroad, especially in Southern Africa, as well as the various ways in which race and racism have embedded themselves in American policy discourse, in American popular consciousness, and at the same time, while embedding themselves within the context of American policy, have also sought to mask their presence and their power and influence. And so I think this is a very timely topic. And so without further ado, I present to you Dr. Prexy Nesbitt. Thank you.
Let me begin with is this thing working? I'm all mic'd up. Can you hear me? Yes. Good. I'll begin with a request. If you all could all move down, I'm mic'd up for 50,000 people, but obviously we aren't that. So if you all could move down, I think we'll have a much more productive and engaged and friendly discussion. And that's what the times call for as well, I think. Very much. Oh, that's wonderful. That's wonderful. And then we can do this like I do my classroom. Then all the people that come in late, we'll put them in the back and then we can point at them throughout class. Let me say, first of all, thanks to David and to the whole community engagement program here at National Louis. I'm really very honored to be at National Louis. Growing up in Chicago as I did, I remember when National Louis was out in Evanston, wasn't it, at one time? And so to have it here closer and to have it as a neighboring institution, because I teach at Columbia College, it makes me feel very, very nice. We will be, to all the faculty here, we will call on you very soon because we are having not friendly discussions at Columbia College to try to keep our tenure as adjunct faculty there. We are unionized, but some of the administration don't seem to be very receptive to the fact of us being very progressive and being unionized. I want to make just a few remarks and then really just entertain dialogue and discussion. The talk is entitled Racism and Denial in the Trump Years. I want to not focus on Donald Trump. I think Trump, like his tweets, is only a messenger. He's a container for much bigger concerns that I want to convey and have us discuss. I was raised in a very conscious, I think young people tell me woke is a much better term, very woke family on Chicago's West Side. I think at one time there were 9 Nesbitts on the Chicago Teachers Union payroll listing, and we were all in one building at 15th and Albany in Lawndale. And I think all of them spent about an average of 28 years as members of the Chicago Teachers Union. And there's some people sitting in this room who were also part of a very collective household we had on the West Side in Lawndale that really had some real presence and fame for how much it was engaged in struggle against the Chicago machine, struggle against corruption in West Lawndale, which was the 24th Ward. So for me, many of these things come directly out of my whole experience. I was raised listening to my parents, aunts, uncles, neighbors, everybody else talk about McCarthyism, about Jim Crow, about lynchings, about the 30s, about Nazism, about what was going on in Oak Park at that time, which was a very wonderful chemist was trying to get a house and they bombed the house. About the Garveyites, about all kinds of forces of both oppression and struggle. I think today's period is what Dalton Trumbull used to call, in a wonderful little booklet, try to get hold of it, he calls it the time of the toad. That period of the compulsive madness of a nation to deny all in its tradition that's clean, to exalt all that's vile, and to destroy any heretical minority which asserts toad meat not to be the delicacy which government edict declares it. It's the Trump years that we discussed today, and not the loathsome individual called Donald Trump. And I think we meet today to take up a much bigger piece of work, of which the question of the denial syndrome is only a part of it. Toni Morrison has a 1995 lecture at Howard in which she prophesied about this period almost precisely. And she says, when our fears have all been serialized, our creativity is censured, our ideas are marketplaced, our rights are sold, our intelligence is sloganized, our strength downsized, our privacy auctioned, when the theatricality, the entertainment value, the marketing of life is complete, we will find ourselves living not in a nation, but in a consortium of industries and wholly unintelligible to ourselves except for what we see through a screen darkly. I think, though, that it's a man by the name of Professor Ibram Kendi who has best articulated the key challenge that we face and we want to discuss today. He said in a January 14th, 2018 New York Times piece entitled "The Heartbeat of Racism is Denial," quote, "Denial is how America defends itself as superior to shithole countries in Africa and elsewhere. Denial is how we paint over the racist reality of self, of society." I want to begin this reflection, my reflections, speaking of Jikanyokas and Mbunches. The term Jikanyoka comes out of the liberation struggles in Mozambique that I was very close to during the period of 1962 to 75. Jikanyokas were a particular type of people who were betraying the values of the liberation struggle. They were people who would do anything for some money. They were informers, they were thieves, they were rapists, they were in dark glasses, expensive suits. Today they'd be wearing a lot of bling bling. There was nothing that they wouldn't do for money, Jikanyokas. They were the dope dealer of today, who himself would never touch the stuff. They were amoral to the max and a particular product of the Portuguese colonial system. They were Toni Morrison's perfect capitalists. Imbunches, the other term I'm going to use, is a term that comes out of the folklore of Chile. I heard it first used in a lecture by the great Ariel Dorfman. Some of you may know he's this Chilean writer who has written this wonderful book, How to Read Donald Duck. If you get a chance, find copies of it. It's so wonderful. Imbunches are sort of replete yuppies. They feel nothing, they see nothing, they hear nothing, they smell nothing. All they care about is their morning lattes and that their Hummers parked outside are not scratched, and maybe that their new condominiums are worth $2 or $3 million. And they don't care about who were the people displaced to get those condos. Though they would vehemently deny it, Jicanhocas and Imbunches are cousins, not yardkin, they're first cousins. They're very close. We've been informed this is the colorblind era. In the colorblind era, whites and some others shut down when discussions come up about race, racism, institutional or structural racism, whiteness, white privilege. Part of that is why I got fired from the AFL-CIO when I wrote a memo in South Africa that was criticizing the failure of the AFL-CIO to be involved enough in the World Conference Against Racism several years ago. And in my memo, I kept using the term institutionalized racism. And my supervisor in the AFL read that and she said, well, you're calling me a racist. And I said, no, I'm talking about structural racism. She couldn't understand that at all, wouldn't go there at all. So I would concede that this is not easy stuff. It's difficult stuff. It's complex. Some of it's mystifying. Some of it's paralyzing, particularly to many white people. But it's also so interrelated, inescapably interrelated with issues like gender, class, and sexual orientation. My thought and my experience is that many white people, especially white people with means and access, live denial lives, or else they blame the victims for the repression and violence that is in so many people of color's lives. Not in their lives, except for maybe an occasional car that they get jacked or that they've had a phone that's been stolen. But basically the kind of violence that this system produces doesn't really impact those people that much. And thus do people become imbunches. Thus do they become unconcerned with what's going on. In May of 2008, the United Church of Christ had a pastoral letter on racism. And they said this: perhaps as disturbing as the glaring economic and social inequities between the races is the increasing disparity of perception about the continuing reality of racism. For people of color in our nation, racism is an ever-present reality that white people too often deny. When the prophets of our day name injustice and seek redress, the urgency of their appeals is too frequently met by the trivializing charge that they are simply playing the race card. If the wound of our people is to be treated with care, our sacred conversations must address this callous and dismissive spirit. There are three stories I want to share with you very quickly. The first is about a failure I had to do what I call Jackie Robinson. I went to a wedding last spring. I was the only person of color in the 300-plus crowd. It was held up in Winnetka. We were bused to the church. As I stood in the line boarding the bus, concerned about my too bright tie and a too light suit, a Mississippi madam said loudly so that all could hear her, my, judging by what I see, I must be getting on the wrong bus. It was a lonely wedding for me. Throughout, I sat in the pew, marveling about how Jackie, meaning Jackie Robinson, endured the insults and the spit. But we live in a colorblind era. The second story is about a modern lynching party. In a relatively well-publicized incident of about 2 years ago, a group of Massachusetts 6th grade private school white boys decided they wanted to stage a lynching. They wanted to know what it was like to be in a lynching. So they brought the ropes from home. They chose the trees that they wanted to use. They chose their victim, who was a young black boy new to the school. And they decided to carry it out during recess. But the victim ran away. No problem, they chose another one. This time they chose an African-American girl. However, the girl had a white playmate who intervened. She went running to the teachers. The teachers were hard at work in another part of the playground, drinking Starbucks. In the end, the teachers prevailed. The lynching party was stopped. The administration expelled the student lynchers, and the parents of the students sued the administration, asserting boys will be boys. Third story. Third story is a story you should know well by now. It's a Chicago story. It's a story about this city where we have been identified as one of the worst situations of police violence anywhere in the United States. And as I've been working and following this and active with Black Lives Matter and trying to be even more active, in a city where, as you know these figures much better than I probably, where whites or blacks and Latinos each a third of the population, 74% of the 404 people shot by the Chicago police between 2008 and 2015 were black. And black people were the subjects in 72% of all the thousands of investigative street stops that take place in Chicago. I've been thinking about this, and it's been very much on my mind today, because we're at one of these moments right now where, and let me be very clear, I regret totally the death of this commander of the police department in the last week or so. Totally regret it. What I also, though, want to point to is the tremendous way it has stopped all life in the city over the police commander being shot. But that doesn't take place when any of these young black or Latino men or women in this city have been shot. And so it ends up with a great inequality. And I think that part of that inequality is related to something else that I don't think gets talked about, and I would love to hear us discuss it. I think there's a direct relationship between the amount of shooting that goes on and the violence of the police department and what I would call the community violence that goes on sanctioning racist acts against black people in this city, particularly in Chicago. That there is a community aura in key parts of the city, if not all over the city, that sanctions the police actions by the silence and by the slowness of response to the injustice of the killings. You get a kind of aura that helps to condone the violence done by the police. Let me put this a different way, more specifically. Some of you may remember last summer, and I think most of you know Chicago, when there was an incident where a black funeral procession stopped in front of the fire station out at 95th Street. And I don't know if any of you have ever had this experience. I've had the experience where if you're near those firemen, and especially near their place, they get really ugly and violent with you about getting out of their way. Well, this funeral procession, which was all black, didn't do that. They didn't get out of the way as the fire truck was backing. And so people attacked, and it led to a shooting that was involved, and a violent racial altercation between not only the firemen in the station, but also white neighbors who witnessed it, and they took on the black people in the funeral procession as well. And so what I'm suggesting is that that's a function of a city that has as a part of its history all of these moments of racial tension that never get talked about, never get taught about, like Trumbull Park, like what happened in terms of the killing of Fred Hampton and Matt Clark. These are things that are not talked about and are pretty much unknown to many people in the city, and that creates what I think is a kind of a community sanctioning of the police. It becomes the reference point that the police turn to when they're out there on the streets and have some incident, and then they feel, yes, they can deal with it by shooting that person because the community really has a sanctioning that goes on of what they do. I think that what we're talking about today is not a one-time conversation. I think it's a conversation that's like a journey. It begs for many, many more people to be part of this continuing journey. And it necessitates long distance running as opposed to sprinting around these issues. I think that if you're an activist in any of the fields of social justice that we confront in these days, I think you have to become completely involved also in the struggle against racism. Because I think the struggle against racism is the cardinal point for all of the struggles that we're talking about in these days, whether they're struggles around sexual orientation, or struggles around environmental issues, or struggles around unionization, or hunger, or homelessness. I think the pivotal issue again and again becomes the struggle about racism and race. And that it can't be done unless we get much more involved. And I think I'm talking kind of to the choir here in this audience here, but I don't think we can do it unless we get much better at talking about race and racism and putting it in the historical context that it takes place. There's been recently, out of Atlanta, they have just issued a new piece that is about teaching history in a way that you take on things like slavery and really teach it in the fullness of what it was and its impact. This made particular sense to me just recently because I had a cousin that told me that Denzel Washington recently pulled his children out of a school out in California, and that he took them out of the school because the teacher wanted to teach about both sides of the slavery, the pros and cons of slavery, that slavery had these pro sides. And Denzel came up to the school and said, "What do you mean slavery has these pro sides?" And I was very struck with this because there's been recently a very important article in the field of African studies that was talking about the positive ledger for colonialism, which we're in an era where we're seeing a lot of that come. And I think that one of the things that we're called upon to do is to teach history in a thorough and very far-reaching way that addresses the fact that so much of the history that's been taught in this country is a history that's incomplete, that's scattered, that never gets into the real depth of details. I teach a course on Nelson Mandela. I can't tell you the number of times college students will say to me, I'm absolutely upset. How could I not know anything about Nelson Mandela and about this struggle that went on against apartheid in the United States? All the years I've been in high school and other courses, I've never learned anything. How is that possible? It's possible totally in a country that has a very long way to go before we teach seriously about slavery, before we teach seriously about what we did to indigenous people, our conquering of indigenous people. All of these questions that we don't teach in any thorough way. And I think that's also very related to the whole thing of leaving race as kind of inviolate, that we really don't get into it. The denial factor comes in again and again. Let me stop at that point and let's just open up, and you all, please, dialogue with me and ask questions, and let's move this on forward. Maybe in this small group, it might be also helpful to have people sort of identify themselves and say something about themselves so we can get real dialogue happening.
Prexy, thanks for being here. I'm Clinton Stockwell. I'm an adjunct prof here at National Louis. Last fall we did a course called Race, Class, and Gender in Trump's America, and the class went so well that the instructor didn't have to be there. Just opened the door and the students just kind of talked through it. I've got at least two of my bright students here, incredible students in the public policy program, so very glad that you're joining us. My question is, from an international perspective, you traveled to Africa, Europe, and other places where there certainly is racism. But what is it that is so unique and endemic to the American cultural experience that it just seems like it's so deeply entrenched and manifested here in very overt ways, and we still seem to just want to ignore it?
I was in an airport one time in Paris, France, and I was sitting there and I hear this voice coming down the hallway, a white American man and his wife, and he's saying to her, I'm going to mimic a little bit. Honey, what's this country we in again? The wife answers, it's France, dear. What do they speak here? French, dear. They don't know English? They speak French, dear. And then went on. And I'm saying to myself, whew, I'll be so glad to get on the plane. I get on the plane, and who is next to me but this same distinguished gentleman? He says to me, you speak English? I said, no English. No English. Don't know English. Well, a few minutes later, I forgot that I told him I didn't know English, and I picked up the Observer or the Economist or something, and I'm reading it. So it made for a totally silent 9.5-hour trip between he and I, next to me. But he got drunk, so I really didn't have to worry about it. I think the arrogance of the United States is a huge factor in why we are unable to understand how imperative it is that we learn not only about the world, but learn about ourselves. You think about something like a simple fact. For the last 3 years, I systematically always ask any of my classrooms if they have heard of Paul Robeson. Never. Never yet a student, maybe one or two in 4 or 5 years. That's a result of the systematic blacking out, if I use that phrase, whiting out, really, of people like Paul Robeson and the Weavers and Charlie Chaplin, that whole thing that went along with McCarthyism. And it goes along also with the homogenizing of American culture that has such deep, deep roots. Imagine whole states that don't want to have any kind of a curriculum that is like the state of Texas, that reflects diversity in any kind of way. And what's happened is that has tremendous impact on what gets published today and what's in American textbooks. Because Texas and California shape what happens to textbook publishing for high school and secondary school students, because the market is based on their buying books. So when they say they don't want curricula, they don't want textbooks that emphasize diversity or talk about multiculturalism or talk about slavery and anti-slavery and the abolitionist, let alone more controversial issues like gay, lesbian, and trans histories of this country. This is all part of, I think, why we have such a difficult task to do. And I think you all, I assume, all know Chicago. I think one of the problems we have is there are huge communities in Chicago where we could never have a discussion even like this at all. And how do we begin to get mechanisms happening to crack those doors open? I think the churches at one point would have been a very, very critical vehicle for doing some of that. But correct me, those of you who are here, but I don't hear of the churches doing much of that anymore. I don't hear of that being enough a part of curriculum of schools. The innovative, pioneering, dynamizing schools are not doing that. The schools and college programs are having trouble to being able to sustain those kind of approaches. I think all of that feeds into this. But the thing I think is most important, although I am enheartened by young people, I think young people today want to have these discussions in a very nitty-gritty way that's very impressive to me. The group that has been doing the work on racism, I can't remember what exactly it's called. It's kind of the white parallel group to Black Lives Matter. Showing up for racial surge. I'm very impressed with surge. Now, they seem to ebb and flow a little bit, and maybe they are confined to certain, but to see surge-type formations move out to the northwest side communities and out to the southwest side communities and way southeast, that would be a big, big beginning. And I think that the young people I meet today want to be part of stuff like that. Of course, they also want to graduate. That's the other thing. And so they face these extraordinary challenges personally that they really have to constantly worry about. You know, when think of our own lives. When you have a debt of $70,000, $80,000, it's awfully hard to get people, and we should be sympathetic to that, to get them to meetings when it interferes with their jobs. Yes?
Rexy, I'll be really interested to see, I'm sorry, my name is Peter Kutner. I'm a filmmaker, union activist. My films have always had something to do with race. I've been involved with Cartemquin films and currently work with the Community Television Network, which takes cameras into distressed neighborhoods, gives them to kids, and they learn how to make films and say the things they want to say. But I hope that you all are aware of the legislation that was done in the city council a couple of years ago around the people who were tortured by the police. You've probably heard about the money that was given to the families, which was terrific. They set up or they're in the process of setting up a community center to talk to families and to talk to people who have been experienced this. But the other thing that kind of slid through the cracks was that they also mandated the public school system, the 8th grade and the 2nd year of high school, to discuss this part of Chicago history, of the institutional racism of the Chicago Police Department and the systematic physical abuse of prisoners to get them to confess to crimes that maybe they did, maybe they didn't, but there's, like slavery, there's no pro side to getting it out. But I don't know whether the program's begun, how it's being done. Each teacher will have to bring his or her own point of view to it. So I'm sure that some of the classes will be very good and some maybe not so good. But maybe it comes to that. Maybe there needs to be legislation. I've raised 3 kids. I have 2 grandkids now. I often thought that beginning with my education in the Chicago public school system in the 50s, that if it had been centered on Africa rather than Europe, and from that point of view, an Afrocentric point of view, we'd have all done a little better in the understanding of the way the world works.
If I may, Peter, just to dialogue further on that, I wonder if it could have been centered and still could be centered on things like Trumbull Park. The Trumbull Park episode in this city's history is a critical one that most people don't have any idea about. And the only reason I know a lot about it is because there was a Jewish woman in our building named Tommy Danish, Tab, who was the main worker for CHA under Elizabeth Woods. And my uncle was a lawyer working for the Federal Housing Authority, whose part of his mandate was to create integrated public low-income housing. Trumbull Park would have been that. But because of what happened at Trumbull Park, it never took place. And this city's administration fought integrated public housing all along in this city. And I think that that's probably characteristic throughout the city. And the other thing I would comment on, I too am very curious about what's being done about the implementation of what was won in terms of teaching about what happened with the Burge story. I wish they would have enlarged the mandate to also teach about what was done to the Black Panther Party and the murder of Fred Hampton. This, I think it's tragic and says a lot that we don't have a single thing memorializing Fred Hampton and Matt Clark and all that group of young people from that period of 1969 who were the target of the counterintelligence program. Nothing. There's a Walgreens that has replaced the Black Panther Party building. There is only Congressman Danny Davis's drawing of Fred Hampton on the side of his building. That's the only thing that I believe exists. I think there's a park somewhere, but a little tiny plaque in it, but it's a history that should be taught to all students in the city. I will be most curious what will happen in the northwest side of Chicago, the far southwest side, around the teaching of the police history here in Chicago, like things like Holman Square. There's no way that out in an area like that area around 95th, Evergreen Park, or what's that, Roselawn, or not Roselawn, Evergreen Park, that southwest side of Chicago, that they're going to let, the police will never, those families will never let the story of Homan Square. You all don't know this story. This was an institution in the old Sears Roebuck building on the west side that was turned into a center for interrogation of young people, mostly black people, some white people too, but it was a place where you were not allowed to have a lawyer. You could not make a phone call. The Guardian of England reports that 7,000 people were taken through there, and there are stories of people being chained up to the desks and tables. This was run as a secret place by the Chicago Police Department. And for those of us from the West Side, it was a kind of continuation of the very famous Fillmore Street police station that was also only a few blocks, you know very well, Peter. So those kind of things, whether those pieces of history will be part of what will be taught under that mandated requirement, we'll see.
It would be a lot easier if we weren't as segregated a city as we are, so that you didn't have all white schools and all black schools.
This would be.
In the raising of my kids, I realized that I don't think there should be private schools. I think if you want religious education, I have no problem with that, but do it on the weekends. Do it after school. I remember all my Catholic friends in grade school would leave early on Wednesday for catechism. If we didn't know the teacher, all of us Jewish kids would too, but then she'd catch us later on when we stayed out for the Jewish holiday, but we were greedy. Sure. But if we had, if somehow we had an integrated society, I don't think racism would go away, but that dialogue would happen every day.
I think that the thing we have to remember with racism in the United States is it's not just the individual, it's structural, it's institutional, and that we have to attack these institutions and structures. I think most people wouldn't realize to this day that redlining has not in any way stopped with regard to the attitude of this city's banks towards poor, predominantly black or Latino neighborhoods, especially black neighborhoods. I think we got to widen it out a little bit, Peter.
I just want to add something to what Peter said. Wasn't just recently there a lot of controversy on the Northwest side about the mandate? And I think that there are some communities, and it's either the Southwest side or the Northwest side, that are challenging the mandate to teach about the Bullard case in their schools. So there's a lot of pushback already in communities where there's probably a lot of police officers.
Yeah, you know, those communities, I remember when I worked with Harold Washington, and I'll never forget a whole detachment of white policemen around Harold who had put on badges in which they had written Chai Congo on the badge. It's sort of like Trump's comment about the toilets, you know? So they were part of his unit. So his immediate security confronted them, but there will be even more pushback from those are hardcore communities. And that's why I say, what are some of the institutions that will be prepared to really confront and wrestle with those hardcore attitudes? Others, please.
Dan Dale, retired UCC pastor. I just came back from a delegation to Honduras, accompanying the social movements in the streets, trying to, well, there's been a fraudulent election after a coup, and the U.S. continues to support the oligarchy and the military, as we always do. And, you know, we were tear gas from Pennsylvania, live ammunition, and the torture, the killings, the disappearances have reminded me of when I lived in El Salvador in the 80s. But I think we have a hard time really getting at the ability of the United States to torture unless we understand the history of slavery. the capacity in the Philippine War, the capacity in our various ventures in Latin America and Africa, that the capacity to mutilate, slaughter, disregard the humanity of people of color, and coming from our treatment, the reality of slavery, and this, you know, from, well, and in Honduras, we're bringing in people that we've trained from Colombia, from Guatemala, from Israel, to shore up the regime in Honduras. We talk about Burge, and some of his folks learned their techniques in Vietnam. But you don't get to Vietnam without the history of terror against people of color in this country. And so just that, unless we understand ourselves better and our history, the inability to really understand our capacity of the empire to be so brutal, we miss, and we can let the State Department continue their myths about the democracy and human rights and all that kind of garbage. But we really got to understand our own history built on terror and torture.
And I would say that it isn't just this history of what we've done in terms of slavery, or additionally lynching, but also what we did to others as well. The treatment of Chinese workers in California when we were building the railroads. You know, the numbers of Chinese workers that were lynched because of looking at white women. Does that sound familiar? Our treatment of Native American people. I asked my students the other day, they were just totally in disbelief when I said, one of the things that happened in the Vietnam War is that soldiers started taking people's scalps and wearing them on the belt. And that scalping didn't come out of the tradition of Native people. It came out of the tradition of the white American forces that went in to devastate all these indigenous people in their land. And that level of brutality, which one finds again and again, is directly related to a country that makes militarism one of the main products of its society. Militarism and the production of why do not people make a connection between militarism and incidents like what happened in Florida just the day before yesterday? How can they continue not to see the connection between those two things? When we have systematically produced people who specialize in killing people in various vicious and sustained systematic ways, barbarous methodologies. That's a product of the American military system. And so for this young man to have done what he did, it comes completely out of the overall economy. And Dan identified what we've done in Central America. I can identify what we've done in Africa, the Middle East. It's all very related one to the other. Now, these are things that most schools aren't going to let there be even approached to be critical about that, you know. And one would hope that a group like that group of athletes that this last year in various sports said, wait a minute, there's something wrong here. One would hope, I keep having this dream that Kaepernick, is that what? Kaepernick will come to Chicago and that the Pritzkers will give me a bunch of money and we can bring all the athletes in and we'll give them these long, wonderful courses about the history of American militarism and why they should continue to take a knee and how deeply it's rooted in the way policing is done in communities. All these things tie together so totally and tie together with, of course, the question of the brutalization of women. This president, the gall of this president, not to speak out on this question of what has been being done to women in this society and the history of it. Well, part of it is he's done it himself. He can't. That's right. He can't, because he's a perpetrator himself. Yes, please.
Good afternoon. My name is Patricia, last name LeCoux. I'm actually a student here at National Louis University. I'm in the PhD Communication Psychology program. And my dissertation is actually studying black women throughout history and connecting slave era narratives to what's happening with black women today. So I'm deconstructing the narrative in order for us to be able to fix the problems, because if we do not understand the past, we cannot really fix the future. We're simply trying to deal with symptoms of a greater problem. So we first of all need to understand formulation. And so one of the things that I have been interested in is really expanding the narrative between ethnic groups, which it seems that's a huge problem that we have. I understand that these are very difficult conversations to have, yet how do we get people to the table, to break down those defenses, to really have these no-holds-barred conversations that we do need to have if we are going to start understanding the issues that we're all facing and that are unique to black people, black women, black men, across the board. So as I think about the Trump administration and how influential him being voted into power, and what we're seeing, because it's not a Trump problem, a large segment of the population voted this man in, so we have to look at the situation from that broad scale as to here we still are, dealing with these racial disparities and attitudes. So do you believe that the Trump administration, in a way, has been influential in opening the door for us to have a lot of these conversations more so than we used to? Because now, in organizations, in any groups you walk into, we are dealing, there are people who feel completely brave to say whatever they want to. Do you think that that is somehow helpful in bringing about more conversations?
No. Do I believe that Trump would have wanted this to happen, and that no, in no way. Do I think that the overall confluence of events that have taken place? Yes, I think that's very true, but I think that's just the objective situation. I think there's a lot of work to be done to make it possible to have those kind of dialogues that you're talking about. I think they're critically necessary. I think if we take the example of this city, for example, I don't know of any groups or any institutions that systematically encourage those kind of dialogues amongst students, for example, where you have Latino students talking to black students, talking to Asian students, talking to white students. And usually, instead, what happens is what I call the Apartheid Ization, where you have one group there, and they have the group, and they have a group, and they have a group, and never do they talk to each other. I think it's critical, and it's incumbent upon the adult population in these institutions to do that. But what I find is that the adult population themselves are not able often to do it. Faculties that really don't set the pace and model such discussions and dialogues in their own lives and in their own writings. I think we need much more of that to be done. Now, there's been some recently, but the modeling of it for schools where they are, my experience in most schools is that there's a black students organization, there's a Latino students organization, there's the progressive whites or the anti-war people, and that they rarely ever talk with each other.
So part of the solution then I would think is for universities like us to be able to create a group as such where individuals from different ethnic groups are invited to come to the table and have such discussions.
I think that that's where the adults take over, and
Right.
they help to stimulate and to stimulate and to sponsor and to encourage the creation of things like that. I also think that the question of the kind of privilege of the university student vis-a-vis others in the communities across the city doesn't get addressed either, that there's some class privilege that never gets addressed whatsoever. I try to tell my students all the time, never look down on those folks that are outside Columbia's college's doors all the time panhandling. I say, you're one paycheck away. Some of them hear that, but I think that the institution doesn't in any way model doing things that address that. I don't know, I've never surveyed, but I wonder how many of the Chicago 2-year and 4-year colleges all have programs working with the Pino institutions in this state.
Right.
What percentage of them? I think it's not very impressive.
Thank you.
And that's incidentally what I would call civic engagement. You know, clearly, this huge population we have of incarcerated people in this country are part of the community that we should be totally engaged with.
Question.
Oh, I'm sorry.
It's okay. Hi, I'm Tiffany Jimenez. I teach for the Community Psychology PhD program, also co-chair of the Civic Engagement Center here at National Louis. And I was just thinking about this concept of institutional racism, and it's a good one to get our head around the complex challenges associated with racism in America. But I guess my challenge with it, because I'm also looking for solutions, is sort of how do you address it? What do you do to tackle institutional racism? And I think you just mentioned some solutions with what you just said, but even in the Trump era and this administration, how can we best position ourselves to really tackle institutional racism?
You know, during the Vietnam War, we used to have these teach-ins. Do you remember them? Oh, you don't. But we used to have teach-ins. And there were moments in which you put everything else on hold, all the rest of the institutional functioning. And for 3 or 4 days, everything shut down and you simply structure serious and in-depth, prolonged discussions and readings. And you bring in resource people for wall-to-wall discussions. Everybody in the institution becomes a part of that encounter, of that exposure. Everybody in the institution, from the highest level of administrator to the most newly arrived young student. I think that those are tremendous moments of institutional growth, and that you have a great plus that's on the other side of that. But I don't know many institutions that really are willing to take the time to do that or to put the resources forward to do that. And maybe they don't even understand how direly important it is to do it. Please.
It seems to me that
Maybe you
there's
should
a
introduce
connection.
yourself to Anne Marie.
My name is Anne Marie Poole, and what am I here? A sort of retired history professor.
Wonderful
and women's
one,
studies
isn't
and
it?
gender studies and all that kind of stuff. Anyway, I was making a connection between what you said, how do we do this, and what you said about the Trump era, because in spite of Trump or whatever he might want, he has so insulted everyone that I think it is a moment where we could talk to each other, and have this. And it seems to me that the first step in solving any of these problems about institutional racism, first you have to sort of open the curtains. You know, you have to uncover where it exists, how it is, you know, sustained, and then you can talk about it. And I do think that this Trump era is uncovering a lot of this stuff just because of how every move he makes insults somebody badly. So I don't know. And I think those teach-ins, I think they were about discovering the different places where injustices hide. And so that you would, you know, by the time that you were done with it, 4 days later, you knew a lot more. Not book sense, but you just sort of understood it a lot more.
You know, it also raises for me this question of silos, struggles that are in silos.
Yeah.
And I think that that's one of the great dangers of these situations. And I, for one, keep hoping that the women's struggle will move on to embrace anti-racism. And that the struggle around issues like sexual orientation will see the automatic relationship to racism and anti-racism. And that has to be a cardinal part of this. It has to be a cardinal rule that we don't separate ourselves off.
Well, I think for the women's movement, that's not going to come from the academy, because feminist studies of any kind now have become so theoretical that they're completely divorced from what's going on in the streets. I mean, people can't read feminist treatises or anything because they don't understand them. It's all soaked into ideology and theories and stuff that it's, you know, it's lost the activism that it had.
But I wonder about institutions like, I don't know here, but I know at UIC that the feminist activists there,
Yeah.
it's just the opposite. Excuse me, if you take people like Beth Ritchie, her work is obviously work that also is addressing the incarceration going on in this country. That's what she's just excellent at that. She addresses, and in her work, she's addressed the whole question also of race around the NFL. She does wonderful work that most people don't hear about around the brutalization that's been done by professional football players to their wives and loved ones.
But you just said most people probably haven't heard about that.
That's the problem.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hi, Gail Stamm. I'm a professor here of psychology, and just a couple of comments. So one thing is, I think if we want to understand racism in the United States, we need to go back a little bit further and look at England, because England was involved with the slave trade, and England has a long history of being brutal and being racist. So it's not just America. It came from the British in particular, and you can see that in the other parts of the world. Also related to apartheid, when I was in South Africa, I was appalled that apartheid laws were passed after World War II. They were not passed earlier, and it was horrible. But the other thing I want to say is two things. I agree about the women's movement. I was marched in Arizona last year and this year, and I was impressed with the diversity of the women that were marching, and families, and grandparents, grandchildren, every race, Indian, Native Americans, Latinos, and we marched together. So this was, I thought, a very positive thing. We talk about Trump, but it's much more than Trump. We have Sessions, we have McConnell, we have Ryan, we have people who are being bought, we have a problem of money, and this is where we have to change things.
I'm very intrigued with what you said, because I've heard a discussion of the Women's March from a group of sisters the other day from a very different vantage point. They said to me that they were very unhappy, actually these were African American women, being at the Women's March here in Chicago because people kept wanting to take their photo as if they were creatures. And I said to them, well, I'm not surprised, because social interaction across races in the city of Chicago is sort of at a minimum in many ways. But what kept happening at the march was people kept wanting to take pictures of the black women at the march. So it says to me that there's so much work to be done around these questions of race that the women's movement has to be very honest about and very candid about, that we got to take it up. And there is that, what's that phrase, intersectionality? When are they going to realize, live intersectionality, as opposed to writing about intersectionality?
That's my question too.
Yeah.
Because intersectionality is everybody who has taken a women's and gender sexuality studies course knows about that, but we don't live it. You know, we know what it is theoretically, but we don't live it on a day-to-day basis.
I think that this is particularly pronounced in Chicago.
Could be.
I think the red line is apartheid's ultimate answer in Chicago. I talk to my students all the time about, get off the red line, get off the red line, go on out through the whole city, know the whole city. But instead, what I keep getting back is that they're too scared to do that. And especially the ones at Columbia, I don't know if it's true here at National Louis, the ones that come from suburbs around here, they are just beyond scared. And I think it comes directly from families and parents they have that have taught them to be scared of the city, to not want to know the city, not embrace that you'll die right away. If you go down to Woodlawn, you will be dead. You know, it's such nonsense. It's such nonsense. Now, they may experience police that will mess with them, but the black community has a history of receiving people. The Mexican community, the same thing. The Asian community. And we got to break down the apartheid barriers of this city. I think that the apartheid masters that passed all those laws, if they had come to study Chicago, they'd have done a much better job. Because Chicago's got it down, boy, to where people self-impose these rules on themselves.
As you're talking about silos and also connecting with, you said you had some hope in the young leaders that are coming up. The kind of connections, intentionality, UIP 100 and OCAD, which grew out of the IJL, Immigrant Youth Justice League, that they consciously have done retreats together, saying we need to build relationships that can sustain us for the long haul, that aren't going to fall apart like when the Harold Washington dies. And the kind of intentionality of that is something where, and their capacity to speak against capitalism, critique imperialism in there. So I'm encouraged by the kind of younger leadership that is trying to figure ways to cross the apartheid in our city and build relationships and connect the issues, that intersectionality that we talk about. So I'm encouraged by some of the younger leadership that are intentionally trying to break down those silos and make some of those connections.
I am too, Dan. I just think that one of the things they also need to take in as part of their perspective is that it's long distance stuff. There's no sprinting in these issues. It takes long, long, long numbers of months and years to get to the other end. Mandela had this wonderful quote. He said, you get past one hillside, and then you got this other hill that you got to begin to climb. And it's a whole series of hills in this city. And you got to just dig in for that long haul, the long, long haul. And I think that's one of the things that I too am impressed about Black Lives Matter and the Latino groups, the Palestinians. There is the beginnings of that. I wish it was spread out at more institutions. I don't know about here, for example, whether these different groupings all also work together. But I've been on too many campuses across this country where black students are in one table, Latino students another, Palestinians here, they have their event, and nothing happens in between. And there's no cross-fertilization, and there's no coming together when each other needs each other. And one of the things that I am very critical about is the role of the faculties and the adults in these institutions that I see where they don't model that themselves. Because we're being taped, I'm going to minimize my comment, but no, we don't. And we've just had a visit by an institution many of you may know out of New Orleans, the People's Institute, I think it's called, that does these kind of trainings to train people to do it. They got to come back a lot more to Columbia.
Hi, so my name is Jonathan. I'm a special education teacher on the south side of Chicago. So my question was just more focused on, as a teacher, sometimes, you know, I have to go into the classroom, but now I feel like it's more, you have to be more on the defensive, you know, because before I would go into a class and just assume the best, like with the other teacher or faculty that I work with. I feel like nowadays is more apparent that you're either on one side or the other side. So even within the school systems that I've worked with, or the schools, that there's no more middle ground. It's hard to find like a middle ground of, I believe some of this or I believe some of that. And I'm just looking at it, do you think in the future, if you had, like in your perspective, like do you see that there's gonna be more possibilities for middle ground, or is it just gonna be more to one side? Because like how I'm saying, like I keep finding myself, like I might go a week or two into it, but then I find out that the person that I'm working with has all these thoughts and all these beliefs and like teaches like this and has these, you know, systems, like very racist ways of teaching students, you know, that I now have to like fight like or deal with, you know. So that I'm asking just like, do you think that there's just in the future more possibilities for middle ground, or is it going to be like a whole thing before we get to more of a consensus?
It's funny, I've not been asked if I thought there was a middle ground very much. I don't know middle grounds. I don't think there's a middle ground in some of these questions. I think that what King was all about, for example, what Chavez was all about, what the struggle of the Iwarkim, Chinese students movement in New York, what all these struggles, the Cohambi Women's Collective, all these struggles are about social justice and about building a better society. And I think that's what we should be about as teachers. And that necessarily means there's not going to be a middle ground, and that we have to pay prices for being engaged. And I think what we need is even more engagement, not less. And I'm impressed with organizations like, or the teaching out of Milwaukee, not Teaching Tolerance, the one in Milwaukee, you know what I'm talking about? They're doing a big special book right now for teachers about how to teach with social justice principles in mind and how to do anti-racism teaching. That's a broad understanding of anti-racism, you know? If you can get hold of it, there's a wonderful, wonderful film footage of Mandela speaking out in Oakland, California, when he was here in 1990. And he comes to the microphone and he reads part of a response he was making to a group of Cherokee Indian people who'd come from Oklahoma to California to hear him speak. And then they interview this wonderful Native American woman who just cried through the whole interview. She said, here he's come all across the ocean, and he's talking about us, she says. And I think that's where we have, I think that's one of the greatest strengths we have. I think we have to make our teaching much more international, much more in dialogue with things happening all over the world and happening next to us. It's just tragic we don't do much more with Mexico. It's tragic that we haven't done much more with Canadian teachers who got very active and forced Canada to issue a public apology to Native people living there. These are things that we, I think, need to tie in more. I'm taking groups of teachers to South Africa and Namibia, and then we're inviting them here. And we're all going to exchange methods of teaching from a social justice perspective for everybody. You're welcome to, it's making the road. You're welcome to take a look at it. We're looking for teachers. And it apparently looks like the Chicago Teachers Union is going to get on board this in a big way.
I'm Rob Morrison. I'm a faculty member and now administrator at National Louis. And I think with racism, the challenge that we face is that it's a deeply embedded narrative in our history in this country. And I'll give you an example. I grew up in Massachusetts. So what I learned was the narrative of the American Revolution and, you know, the British imperialism, which is ironic because now America is now an imperialistic country, but that's probably another tangent. But what I learned in public school was really the narrative of that, you know, Paul Revere and others. And in third or fourth grade, we were actually reenacting the Battle of Bunker Hill. So it was really ingrained in us, you know, the colonial struggle. And you didn't even mention, you know, the enslavement of human beings or how women and children were used as well in the cotton mills in New England. So that's really, I think, that narrative is still powerful in white culture, which I come from and that I have still seen. And I see that in how people see the history of Native Americans in this country. That also has been whitewashed as well. They are called savages, and also there's a perspective that they didn't use the land the way we do. They're not entrepreneurial, they don't like to strip mine or frack or do other things, and so they're really not using the land. And these are conversations I've had with people over the years. So I think that's what I see with what's happening with Trump and the Republican Party and others, is that there's that powerful narrative is still very much alive. And it's really embedded with religion and militarism and patriotism. It's pretty dangerous. And that's what I see, is that counter narratives are really one of the ways that we can try and get through to that. Because I have talked to a lot of white people who they don't quite understand the embedded racism piece. It's so subtle, they don't understand it.
And you're here at this institution?
Yes.
And is there a group that is actively promoting the counter-narrative and doing the kind of things that help to reconstruct and create a real people's history? A group, for instance, that, what is it Howard Zinn says all the time, you can't be neutral on a moving train? Are you all getting on the train?
I see that embedded in the teaching here, because that's where I learned a lot of counter-narratives, was in a doctoral program here, but I also learned other counter-narratives when I was an undergraduate. I never saw it in public schools. And I think that's where we really need to have that narrative.
We agree.
Is in the public education area, because children need to learn that early.
We agree. I just think, all I'm saying is it's not going to be an easy struggle to get it implemented and get it institutionalized and find the people that are going to be the brave souls who are going to really take the steps necessary to do that. It's not done overnight. It takes a period of real intense work and commitment and paying the price. But I believe it's totally worth it. As you do, I'm hearing you say the same thing.
Oh, yes, I agree.
We just started from this year talking about social justice and teaching. They started like online Zoom meetings across institutions. So not everybody involved yet.
You know, I can't name the school, but a very good friend of mine came here to do equity, affirmative action, diversity education. And she was appointed as the dean at the school. And one of the board members of the school came up to the school one day and found teachers at the school wearing T-shirts that were supporting students who had come out in terms of their sexual orientation. These T-shirts were supporting those students. And this board member was getting ready to give the school, I'm told, $1.5 million. And he saw the T-shirts and immediately called the principal and said, I want that dean out by next week. Because he was so upset at seeing this being done. So that's, I'm saying, those are prices we have to get ready for. Because these things are very deeply rooted that we're working with. It's not going to be easy to really unearth and reconstruct and create new historical narratives. It's not going to be easy.
That book you were talking about is
Rethinking Schools, that's right. That's it, out of Milwaukee. Wonderful. Do you all know that resource? It's a great resource. And one other thing, some of you might want to get on the planes this Friday, the North Dakota Study Group. Have you know them at all? Any? You know them? They're meeting down in Mississippi this year. And also coming up next year, out of Mississippi is going to be a group of actors and dancers who are going to do anti-racism theater along the lines of immigration, comparing the immigrations of different peoples. It's going to be beautiful stuff. So this is an institution, I'd like to tell them, that would be one of the places that will receive that coming here when they get to Chicago.
My name is David Poole. Prexy is an old family friend of my sister's and mine. I'm from Albuquerque, and I'm actually here taking part in another conference here in Chicago. But I wanted to hear this lecture, so I'm here, and I want to pose something just for your response, Prexy, that comes from my experience. There's a man named Eric Law who is a Chinese-American Episcopal priest. And he's written extensively on the issue of multiculturalism within the church. And I've read all of his books. We did a study group, the church that I served as a music director for decades, in an attempt to try to it's not as integrated as it should be, being in Albuquerque. We were all aware of that, and we studied this question. And the point that comes across in all of Eric Law's writings, which is kind of counterintuitive, and that's the reason I'm bringing it up, is he said the mistake that a lot of churches make is to say, okay, we have, 90% white people, and then we have this smattering of people of color. And what we're going to do with those people of color, we're going to sprinkle them around in the church to try to, integrate them. He says the thing, what people should be doing is allowing, because this goes right against what you said earlier. What he said, what you should be doing is, you have 5 Native American people in your congregation. don't break them up. Allow them to be a group, because one of the main conflicts that we come up against in trying to be multicultural is a recognition that in white America, it's all about the individual. For a lot of cultures from which people of color come, it's all about the community. Okay, so they derive, that this Native American person derives his or her strength from that group, from being part of that community. Breaking them up and sprinkling and putting them in committees and stuff is, you know, that doesn't empower them. And so this is really the gist of his writing, is that's not the way to do it. The way to do it is to allow them to draw their strength from their community. And somehow, yes, somehow the challenge then is how to mix the communities, perhaps, rather than the individuals. So I'm just wondering, how does that, and he's really just speaking about the church. He's not generalizing this as something that goes beyond, you know, the larger culture. But to what extent do you think it is a factor that, you know, trying to integrate into an America that is driven by this sort of individualism, constant individualism, it's about me, it's about, you know, is that at odds with the culture of some of the people who we are who struggle to try to integrate in America?
I think it raises a much bigger question. You have several questions that are very, very big ones there. I totally would agree with the self-determination that's necessary, and space and freedom that's required for those people who are in those dominant, predominantly white congregations or schools. I think all of this raises deep, deep, deep questions about the overall goals and structures of the United States. And that the implications of those questions are, how do you get a system and a country that affirms human life? And we don't have that in this country. I mean, I've seen a lot of the world. We don't have it on any level. And so I think one of the things often that those small pockets of people of color are raising in their experiences with those dominantly white congregations is they're saying, wait a minute, we're about a different set of values that you ought to be about too. I remember taking a course at the University of Chicago. I don't mind saying because what school this was, because it's such a giant, such a behemoth. I took a course on the Third World. And it was taught by this guy who was one of the top experts of the Third World. And there were only, the Third World being Asia, Africa, and Latin America. And there were only 6 of us in the seminar, graduate PhD seminar. And it was about the Third World and the values of the Third World. We were going to analyze. And the day the course met for the first time was at his house. I had been walking all day long, and I get to his house, dizzy from hunger. And he's sitting there at a table with this beautiful chunk of wood and this corned beef piece, succulent, steaming. He's cutting it with this fine silverware. And he says to his wife, he couldn't even do it himself, get him some grapes. I said, wait a minute. I just said to him, I said, wait a minute. You're eating that corned beef sandwich, and you're going to give us some grapes, and you're going to teach a course on the Third World? I said, not to me, you aren't going to teach anything. Because throughout the Third World, one of the values that you see, and I think it comes out of the situation people who are oppressed in this country, one of the values is sharing and giving. And you come into somebody's house and they immediately, well, we ain't got much, but you can have what we got. And that's articulated in South Africa in terms of a specific philosophy called Ubuntu. And Ubuntu means I am because you are. We are in this together. And people, and I found variants of that all over the world. Asia, Latin America, variants of that philosophy. But I don't find it in middle class white America. Dick, Jane, Spot. I hit you on your head if you come near my property, America. You find it in poor America, from Appalachia to Mississippi to Native American places. So I think there's a twofold process. And I think that one of the other things that's incumbent upon us is to look at the basic structures and values of what this country represents and what it represents to the whole world. And that's long been an implication of what King was talking about with the threefold militarism, racism, and poverty. It's what he was talking about. He saw that globally. He saw it reflected in the Vietnam War. And we should certainly see it reflected in the kinds of stuff this administration is doing today. And so I think that means that those churches have a twofold process. It's both about giving space to people of color, for them to grow and to be clear and firm, and maybe to learn that those predominantly white churches learn from those folks. And the other part of it is to challenge the big principalities and powers. I think that's the way you all theologically put it. I don't know the church. I'm a working man that just got out here in the struggle. But the church, I did have a AME minister grandfather who said a whole lot about things that are the basic values of Christianity. Yeah. And I was reading Cedric Robinson. If you all have a chance, read this guy. This was one of the most brilliant writers on racism that we ever had. He died about 6-7 years ago. He's just a wonderful man. Cedric Robinson. Something of blackness. I can't remember. But so much of the stuff is geared at changing our sense of humanity, opening up us to be more affirming of everybody. And I think that's one of the other byproducts of allowing the growth of those people and supporting them and making them feel like this is home, but I can grow.
Having been in churches that have used the law materials, physical priest material on racism in the church and diversity, you've raised the question of redlining and segregation and the question of apartheid and the way that we and the new, what is it, The Color of Law, this book that came out last year that really looks at that whole history of not the de facto but de jure segregation in all of our urban areas. The church is complicit in supporting that segregation and the kind of wanting to have diverse congregations without addressing the historic segregation that we have promoted, and unless we address some of those issues of redlining, of segregation, of the apartheid history, the question of trying to create artificial communities that are diverse without addressing some of those structural issues, I think is a problem, and I think the law doesn't address the historic segregation that, not the current reality that comes from that participation in creating a apartheid regime here in urban America. So that's, I think, something that law talks about, the individualismo of white culture, but doesn't address the segregation issue and in place some of the one experience of University Church in Hyde Park. Well, let's see, with Charlie Bear starting in the 60s. And it's taken all that long to finally get to a multiracial church with black leadership. And it's it's something that takes generations to actually move a community of faith from being a predominantly white congregation to something to a truly multiracial congregation with leadership from people of color. It's just something that takes generations.
The Unitarian Church, I always tease my friends who are in the Unitarian Church, And I always say, you're finally learning how to sing. But in actual fact, there are Unitarian churches which take this in a very principled way. And if you take a place like All Souls Unitarian Church in DC, which has a very mixed choir, racially mixed, but they have incredible music. It's just, if you close your eyes, you just think it's a black choir. It's a Baptist choir from Mississippi. You just close your eyes, that's what they sound like. But I think churches have to very intentionally do this and intentionally be willing to take on the structures of power. For me, that's the only way a church operates. But I think many churches don't do that way. For me, because my family's church was the little old Warren Avenue Congregational Church on the west side of Chicago that hosted Dr. King when no other churches would host them, it did that in a principled way. There were only 40, 50 members, and it paid a horrible price. When the FBI started going around to all those members after King and them left, after being here 65 and 66, it destroyed the church. Some of those members this was it, when the FBI started making the visits. And of course, as we learned later, that was part of the FBI's whole gauntlet against King. It would end up with, for whether you believe Earl Ray did it or not, it ends up with 1968 assassination of Martin Luther King. And so it was a real learning lesson and it's not accidental that many of us who came out of that church as young people are people who are still very actively engaged in social change initiatives and efforts.
So I'm going to muddle through this because I really don't know how to ask or say what I need to say. My name is Mary Scott Boria. I teach with my colleague here, Dorothy Burge. I was a young person who was a tenant in Prexy's father's building. I learned a lot about social justice and politics and race and internationalism and all of those topics by being around people in the 60s. And it seems like to me in the 60s, everybody thought like I did and lived like I did and absorbed the teachings that were so prolific. So I guess what I'm saying, I want to sort of like echo something that you said, because I almost felt like what I heard you say is that Trump's racism and Trump's hatred has opened the doors for us to have conversations that perhaps we were either too shy about having, inarticulate about having. He has unleashed both outrage from people who sort of are opposed to him, as well as he has also unleashed people who support him. So I don't know what the saying is. It says, I'd rather see the devil I know than the one I don't. So we get to see them now. We get to see who they are because they're out there. And I don't know that I want to believe that there's a good number, a majority of people who feel the way he does. I think there's a loud, vocal group. There's a loud group in power who has now the floor and can spout. I was listening to the radio accidentally. I was listening to the radio and I thought I had progressive talk on the radio. And then I sort of realized I had like the Rush Limbaugh channel on the radio. And I said, if this is what people listen to every day, it's damn compelling. If that's all you hear, if that's all you hear, if it's like, that's all that goes in your ear. And I said, I'm so glad I hear something else. I'm glad that I am able to listen to something else because I'm able to sort of balance and see where this is crap on the other end. So I'm always wondering, what do we do to go beyond preaching to the choir? Because in order to sort of win this battle, we got to be bigger than who we are. We've got to be more influential than what we've been. We've got to have conversations that we've not had, and we've got to figure out where there might be some allies that perhaps we closed the door to before. How do we engage people? My granddaughter's third grade teacher grew up in the same town that I grew up in Michigan, and she has so little knowledge of what that town is that I have knowledge of. But she's here, she's in the teachers union, but she says, I can't go home and talk to my parents because they all voted for Trump. And so she's talking to me. She need to be talking to them, because I feel as if we've got to figure out how to raise up people who've been kind of silent. How do we empower the voiceless to make change? Because I feel like we just kind of keep talking to each other.
To the choir.
Yeah.
I agree. I mean, I think that's a very serious problem. And I think one of the manifestations of it also is we don't have access to a media that really reaches out to that group or is attractive to that group. I eat breakfast often at the same place all the time, and there's a whole group of construction worker guys that come in there, all white, who, because the waitresses like me very much, over time they have come to accept who I am and even ask about myself and my cousin from time to time. But I noticed that one of the things they do religiously is to read the Sun-Times. Religiously. We don't have a publication that reaches that group in the way that's the Sun-Times and Rush Limbaugh. And I know that the radio they listen to is, what's that guy, Hannity, exactly. That's our challenge. And I think that one of the things that may help us do it is young people who are very clear about use of culture and vehicles in a way that those of us in the 60s ain't. And if we help them get their understandings of history better and their values very firm themselves, I think their use of the technology will help to change some of that.
I'm sorry. I got to defend the Sun-Times here. I've been a Sun-Times reader since I learned how to read. And things have changed at the Sun-Times. I used to say, Prexy and I are neighbors in Oak Park. And I have a neighbor who happens to be the negotiator for the Chicago Teachers Union, a white lawyer. And we used to believe that he and I were the only two people in Oak Park who had subscriptions to the Sun-Times. But you should know that recently you may not have been paying attention in your international and global lens that you look through.
Sun-Times.
But the unions bought into the Sun-Times and they saved it. And the Sun-Times is getting, you know, not that they're liberal, it's still all full of the media that only black people do bad things, but it's getting better. And I think that some of us learned in the 60s that we could reach over some of those barriers. The group that I worked with was doing white working class and working poor organizing, and race was the big thing. And we weren't afraid to talk about it. And I think that's where we got to go. We got to get brave. We see all these idiots talking up, brave enough to talk, and we know we're smarter than them, so it's time for us to speak up.
I think it would be great to see a whole series in the Sun-Times by people from Rising Up Angry, that depicts what their lives have been like, what they believe in, who they are, and that you can say things to those construction workers that they aren't going to hear from me. And they especially aren't going to hear from me since if they knew that I was married interracially. You see? They aren't about to listen to me then. Because for them, that's a line that cannot cross, you know, to have messed with their, and that's some of the stuff we got to get down to really wrestle with in this country.
Are you talking about Al's Ham on the Bone? Is that the restaurant you go to?
Yeah, Al's. That's
Al's,
the place.
yeah, right.
This is
well, you don't know.
This is an Oak Park thing. So, an Oak Park.
It's our Valois.
Is what?
It's our Valois.
Yeah. We'll have to take you there, David. You don't have it in Albuquerque, but we have so many contradictions like this. But the interesting thing that's very learning about it is many, many, many black people come there. And black people come to this restaurant in Oak Park because it's safe. And because it's a restaurant that's accessible. In the hood, the violence is so deep, restaurants can't last. Restaurants don't stay open. Restaurants don't, as much as I love, what's the soul food we have on Madison and Austin? Huh? MacArthur's. Much as I love it, that's grease, man. That stuff is nothing but grease. And I love cabbage. I love the chicken. I love the hot sauce. But it is not healthy food. So, and young people all know that, right? So I will take my students there once, but let me try to get them to go again? No way. They are going to go.
Yeah, I got one more thing. I'm sorry. I know I talk a lot, but now that I got you reeling, I got you on the ropes about the Sun-Times. You don't know anything about those workers. You don't know how many of them are in interracial relationships. You don't know where they live. You're doing the same thing that the bad guys do.
No, in this case, Peter, I know them because I've been around them for 2 years.
Then I apologize.
Yes.
Now I'm on the ropes.
But I hear what you're saying. I hear what you're saying. And I think that's a very important point, because I think one of the other things that does happen in America is that you can get some of the most right-wing reactionary people who will at the same, racist with all their values, at the same time they will have a great friendship with such and such a person that they have had for years. Okay, you see what I'm saying? And I agree, that can happen. I think that then takes a special kind of working with them. You know, when my mother died, I'm going to give you an example. We used to go to Wisconsin all the time. And there were right-wing, racist people, farmers up there, who hated Chicago and feared black people so much, they would never come to visit us. But when my mother died, because they loved Sadie Nesbitt so much, they came down in 10 carloads of people. And their children are all a different kettle of fish on this whole question. You do it. America it's a challenge. I still think we have to do it over time. Nothing gets done like that.
Well, I just wanted to step in and respect everybody's time. It is 6 p.m. and I just want to let everyone know. You guys can continue to talk, though, if you would like. And I don't know if anyone else had questions or if I could hand the mic. Thank you.
Thank you for all coming out.